Start the recording. Okay, so here we are. Welcome back, everybody. For those of you who don't know, maybe you're tuning in for the first time. I just had lunch, so excuse me. Yeah, maybe you're tuning in for the first time, and you don't know. If you want to see the slides, if you want to watch live what's happening, maybe you also want to be a part of the viewing session here. You can find the link to the Zoom records that are live or the Zoom recording right now. You can find that in the link in my bio. So feel free to go to my page, click the link, and then you can join in on the Zoom chat session. I actually forgot to do something for just a second. So for those of you who are watching my screen share for just a moment, give me a second to modify a few settings here. Hold on one second, and then we'll go ahead and we'll get started. Um, Sorry, I'm a one-man show, one-man army. I don't have my mod today, and you're just gonna have to work with me. We're almost there. There we go. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Hopefully, let me confirm you can see me. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. Okay, so welcome back. This week we're talking about racism and immigration policy. And from here on out, we're basically talking about not necessarily an eclectic number of topics related to just random things that are disjointed, but I'm trying to give you a comprehensive exposure of basically all of the ways that racism permeates American society. And in doing my best, we're probing the different aspects here. And one of those that is certainly relevant to what's going on in present history or present times is immigration policy. And there's lots of claims and assertions around immigration policy and policy enforcement being racist. What did it look like in American history? What did it look like? What were those things that people did? How does it inform how we observe today? That's basically what we're diving into here. So for those of you who are new, we're basically going to be doing weekly lectures, 1 hour, and then at the end of the hour or so, give or take a few minutes, I then open it up for a Q&A where you're welcome to ask me any questions. Generally, I like to take questions around the topics, but if you have questions about race and racism just in general, I invite you to chime in and share your thoughts, share your opinions, or perhaps even your own perspectives and experiences with the audience. So let's go ahead and get started here. The first thing, right, is that obviously immigration is a very controversial topic. It's complex, and it does not necessarily start with 1776. However, all of the debates around what constitutes appropriate U.S. immigration does in fact start around the year 1776. Hopefully, you are at least loosely familiar with American history enough to know that 1776 is the year in which the colonies are establishing themselves as their own independent nation, separate from the British monarchy, right? And so, as their own separate and independent nation, uh, you have these ongoing philosophical debates about what an American is, what an American patriot is. And there are these debates about who is actually entitled to American rights and freedoms. And in those freedoms, I'm condensing them down to the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuits of happiness, right? Who gets access to those things by virtue of being an American? These are questions that never really had to be answered in any prior time in history, at least with relation to the colonization of the Americas. And part of the reason for that is because most of the European countries, whether that's France or Italy or Germany or Ireland or England or something like that, most of these European countries have existed for thousands of years. And so, to some extent, through a timeline of cultural evolution, you have to understand that what it meant to be English, what it meant to be Dutch, what it meant to be French, etc., was really just implicit about where you're from, and that the culture of those people, the culture of that country, belongs to the people of that specific region. And there isn't necessarily a need to artificially draw lines around what constitutes a Frenchman versus who is not a Frenchman, right? So, in the context of the United States of America, you have this fundamental question about, okay, we need to legitimize ourselves as a country, but who gets to be American? And so, on that basis, then, there are debates. There are, in fact, some people who are saying, well, technically, the people who we've been calling American this entire time, and in this context, those are the natives. Well, they're American. They're born here. They were native to here. But in the context of this country, this independent nation declaring itself independent, they have no interest in protecting the rights and freedoms of the natives that they are trying to displace by any means necessary, including enacting genocide, right? Well, what about the African slaves that are here as well? Many of them have been born here just like their white overseers and white slave masters. Well, no, there's not really an interest in protecting the rights and freedoms of those people because they're slaves. What they're at the lowest end of the totem pole. Why are you doing this, right? But you still have an influx of these European immigrants that are coming into what is now the United States. And so they are bringing with them their own European identities. They don't just abandon France. They don't just abandon Spanish culture. They don't just abandon Irish culture. They're bringing those things to these new lands and so are still carrying their identity with the lands they're leaving behind. Okay, so then you have a generation of white people now who have never been to England, who don't identify as English, who don't identify as British, and so find themselves in a frame of identity where they see themselves as being distinct from the European immigrants that are still coming in. And so around the debates around who gets to be American, it's by the 1780s that you start getting the emergence of this movement called nativism. And nativism is this idea that if you are white and you're native and you're born in this land, that should prioritize your access to American citizenship over the people who are coming fresh off of the boats. And certainly, we're not giving American rights and freedoms to the Native Americans. We're not giving rights and freedoms to our nigger slaves. We're only going to be organizing political power and privilege to the white people that we want to give it to. So, what's happening here is as you get these waves of European migrants that are getting fresh off of the boat, it's still fueling this notion around xenophobia. And the xenophobia, believe it or not, is also getting contextualized by the fact that prior to the Declaration of Independence, you had lots of conflicts that were going on in the Old World. Maybe it was England versus the Spanish, maybe it was the Spanish versus the French, or whatever, and they're battling over resources, they're battling over trade routes, they're battling over these things. And so they're trying to project onto the colonizers in the Americas. It didn't matter if it was the Spanish colonies or the French colonies or the English colonies. They're basically saying that if we're at war with our European counterparts over here, then you need to be at war with the European counterparts over there too. And these Americans are like, well, why? Why do we need to fight? That's your war. That's your battle. We're over here and we're living our lives. We're trading resources. We're doing just fine. And now you want us to start launching war with people who we're actually friends with. How does this make any sense? So now this is also fueling this notion of like, get rid of the foreigners. Foreigners, you don't belong here. You don't represent our values. You don't have anything to do with what it means to be American. And as we're establishing ourselves as a free and independent nation, we certainly don't want a fresh waves of immigrants coming in and somehow channeling the sentiments of the European counterparts that we don't even identify with anymore. So you can see then how exploring these ideas, it results in the emergence of a movement called nativism, where nativism, we are not necessarily talking about the politics, the rights, the freedoms of either the African descended slaves or the natives that are in this land too, but prioritizing whiteness. Okay. So by the time you get to 1790, we're at the height of like political tensions. Sometimes it's violent. You have sporadic riots here and there, but really these are just inflamed debates. I would almost, to my knowledge anyway, I would characterize it very much like the political tension we are currently observing in modern American times. Is it's not really violent. It seems like there are some pockets of people that are like eager to lean into violence, but really it's just kind of like emotionally volatile and hostile. And that's like the height of it right now. So you have Congress, an independent body of government that is looking to organize and officiate laws to regulate American society to some extent. Not unilaterally, obviously, because the states represent a division of power, but you have a congressional body of elected representatives that are appointed with the responsibility of trying to mitigate the political hostility, the political conflict. So by 1790, you get the passing of what's called the Naturalization Act. And generally, it's called the Naturalization Act of 1790. Now, this on its own is not necessarily immigration policy, but they're attempting to try to resolve the debate around who is an American, who gets to be an American, because at some level, even with the number of white people that currently occupy the colonial territories, you still need more European immigrants that are coming from overseas. You still need that. And there's some recognition that by virtue of them leaving their homeland, they have to become naturalized citizens of this land at some point in time. And so the passing of this bill and the language of this bill is very specific. And I include a little snippet of it here. This is a scan of it. I'll read a little bit of the bill to you, and you can listen for yourself. But essentially, they say, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that any alien other than an alien enemy, being a free white person, who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years, may be admitted to become a citizen thereof on application to any common law court of record, and any one of the states wherein he shall have resided for the term of 1 year at least, and making proof to the satisfaction of such court that he is a person of good character, and taking the oath of affirmation prescribed by the law to support the Constitution of the United States, blah, 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 blah. The thing I want you to take away from this is the language is very clear here. They're talking about free white people of good character and of good moral standing, right? And so this is the language that then not only codifies or at least legislates what qualifies a person to be an American citizen, but believe it or not, the cultural ramifications of this bill still exist today. That when we refer to people as quote unquote American, what we've adopted in our culture is this notion that to be American is by default to be white. And it's interesting. In my classes, I like to emphasize this notion that, for when a law passes, it doesn't automatically become cultural. It just becomes words on a paper. But at some point down the line, like down successive generations, the enforcement of those laws becomes the culture. And so, by virtue of the enforcement of this law becoming the culture, prior to the passing of this law, when anyone was referred to as an American, what they understood that to mean was these melanated red people. The red people were the Americans. This is often why I like to use the language of calling them the first Americans, right? But even then, right, our culture has normalized this notion that in order for you to be American, you must first be white. And then if you are not white, but you belong to the country of America, then your racial identity goes before your identity as an American. And so the only way you can then be American, essentially a real American, is to be white. And this is a sentiment that is internalized both in an unarticulated way, in an assumed way by most of the world, as well as the people belonging to this country, right? And so on this basis, then, they're saying, well, yeah, you're a European immigrant, but after 2 years, you get all of the rights and freedoms that any other ordinary American citizen does, while explicitly denying the rights and freedoms and privileges of American society to the red people and to the black people, obviously. Okay. So American immigration policy, right, is starting with race consciousness and racial discrimination. And that sets the cultural precedent for how we treat foreigners and immigrants moving down the line, right? is that all you had to do was live in the land for 2 years. And after 2 years, then you get to vote, then you get to own land, perhaps you own slaves, maybe you want to start a business, but as long as you are white, that's where this comes from. Part of the other reason why they're saying white here comes from this notion of, well, the Spanish neighbors they were always referring to their slaves as los negros, or the blacks. And so where you had originally these European immigrants who either identified as Spanish or Portuguese or French or English, now you have to find a way to be able to give all of these European identified or European descendant people political power, even though they don't necessarily identify with the land that their ancestors may have came from. So this also corresponds to the invention of the racial identity of whiteness, is that what we're calling white never existed in Europe. It's just that this identity was artificially created in contrast to what we were referring to as the blacks. And if they are the blacks and we consider them to be at the lowest end of the totem pole, then we are the whites because we consider ourselves to be, for all intents and purposes, superior, right? Okay. So they are intentionally denying citizenship and therefore American rights and freedoms to enslaved Africans, what would later become Asians or Asian identifying people, but not yet at this particular point in time, and then the Native Americans too. And so, by virtue of this, you are trying to grant citizenship by virtue of being born here. So, you are both a citizen of the United States if you are a person who is born in these lands. But then, if you are an immigrant too, then you can also become a citizen after 2 years of having immigrated here. And so, what does that mean then? It means that you get a legislative denial and therefore a racialization of policy where we are denying equal rights, privileges, and power to people of color while intentionally allocating and consolidating all of that political power to what we are now calling white, an artificial construct literally made from an identity of people we were just calling black. Okay. At the same time, right, you still have these European immigrants that are coming into these lands, and because they're coming from uh, a land in which they knew the humanity of Africans, they're coming from the old world. They haven't internalized this belief that like somehow Africans are like humanitarily inferior, anthropologically inferior, intellectually inferior, etc. Okay. So they're coming to these lands and they're seeing how the red people, how the black people are being treated. And it's causing division where European immigrants are upset at these white Americans because they are mistreating other human beings. While white Americans have internalized this notion of what would eventually be called manifest destiny nationalism. It's a kind of interesting mix between Christian theology, geopolitics, or in relation to this new country we're calling America, conservative geopolitics, and then this notion that in order for you to be a real patriot, in order for you to prioritize the true interests of the country, the true interest of the country is taking as much land as feasibly possible. We're not just stopping with the colonies, but we're going to go to the other end of this land, however long it takes us, right? So American whites are developing a sense of like entitlement, both to this notion of freedom, to this notion of ownership, and to this notion of like land and property rights. And they truly believe to some extent that like God wills their takeover of this land, even if it comes at the intentional slaughter and displacement of the natives, if it comes at the intentional enslavement of Africans, that like this is what God wants us to do. And so they feel justified in doing so. And so what's happening is while you're getting this wave of like European immigrants that after a period of 2 years, they suddenly get the same rights as all of these white people, these European immigrants are coming in and they're saying, hey, like, why are you doing this to these Africans? This is wrong. It's wrong for moral reasons. It's wrong for spiritual reasons. This is not These are not the politics of Jesus. These are not the politics of Christ. This does not represent the values of the land that I want to live in, even though I migrated here, right? And so that's fueling violence and tensions between white Americans and European immigrants, as well as black, as well as red. Everybody is pissed off, and it's heightened anger and animosity around the politics of racism and racial freedom. Okay. So what's happening is scientific racism is also growing cultural precedent and relevancy too. Is that part of the racial tensions that are motivating all of this violence is coming from these American ethnologists that are trying to conduct scientifically meritorious research, and in so doing are characterizing European immigrants as somehow being like a lesser evolved form of a white person or a white kind of person. And so they're adding to this notion that there is, in fact, a racial hierarchy. And not only are Black people at the bottom, but like Europeans and European immigrants are like a lesser empowered form of man than even American whites. Okay. So they're rejecting this idea, the scientific idea that has existed at this particular time, too, that's saying that physical characteristics, mental characteristics are a product of individuals' environment, and not necessarily about their race. And ethnologists are leaning into this notion that like racial differences are inherently intrinsic by virtue of the genes that you have or that you're born with. And so if you're born with like these European genes, you opt for like stupid politics. Like you're a little dim-witted and you just don't know how to make sense of the world around you. And that's why all of these Europeans are like pro abolition. They're pro racial equality. They're pro all of these things. Is because they don't have the same sense of like intellectual prowess and let's say academic merit as like an American white does. So ethnologists are adding to these violent tensions because they're going, well, hey, there's all these Europeans that are coming in here, and after 2 years they get the right to vote, but apparently, according to the science, they're like inherently inferior too. Maybe yes, by comparison, they're superior to these Africans, but they're inferior to us. So like, why does their vote count the same as ours? And so you can see then how that would even contribute to the violence that's happening here. So ethnologists during this particular time are giving American whites like a scientifically justified basis, not only to continue enslaving Africans, to selectively breeding Africans, but also committing genocide and displacement of the natives, but also conducting like a kind of vigilantism against European whites. Okay. And that's on this idea that like now we're beginning to understand that to some scientific sense, to some biological sense, to some genetic sense, that like immigration from Europe even poses a threat to like American supremacy or like American superiority or like American purity. Simultaneously, what's happening? We fast forward through time just a few decades. By 1822, Mexico has declared independence from Spain. And only shortly thereafter, by 1829, they completely abolished slavery within their borders. But you had Americans, mostly in the South, that were heavily invested in the culture of slavery. And so you have this region called Texas that was a fundamental part of Mexico. And Texas is also developing a pro-slavery culture. And yes, I'm talking about the Mexicans in Texas. They have an interest in preserving their culture of slavery, and they feel about slavery more or less the exact same way that the American South does. And so, as America is taking over and annexing new lands, believe it or not, Texas declares independence from Mexico in 1836. And it's by 1845 that they're like asking the United States to come and annex them because they would like to maintain slave culture and to have laws that sustain slavery in the United States. They see slavery as beneficial. They see it as a culture they want to keep. And they don't want to be a part of Mexico if Mexico is fundamentally abolishing slavery. Also, on this principle that it's immoral, it's unjust, It's atrocious, right? And so you have Americans that before even Texas was like annexed several years before, you have Americans that are like, t- by technicality, illegally crossing the border. Now, laws didn't exist, so I'm kind of putting a little selective emphasis on illegally crossing the border, but they're like crossing the border into a land that doesn't technically belong to them in order to plant their roots and then expand their slave plantations. Okay. So keep this in mind. So by the time we get to the 1840s, you have like division in the United States. And there's a political movement called nativism. This would ultimately evolve into the modern form of nationalism that we see today, where nativism is is this political movement that if you are native to the Americas, a real native, a real patriot, a real American is pro slavery. A real American is anti racial equality. A real American is pro expansion and annexation of new lands so that we can expand our culture of slavery. And if somehow, even though as a citizen of this country, you like somehow are against these ideals, you can't possibly be as American as the real patriots are. You're not a native, you're not a patriot. Okay. So even there, the politics of nativism here is like pitting these native born Protestant Christians against like foreign born Roman Catholics. And yes, they all to some extent identify as Christian, but what kind of Christian largely depends on the land that you were born in or may have resided in and the heritage and ethnicity of your people. Okay. So what's happening here is even nativism now is fueling like a kind of morally entitled waves of violence towards people who do not represent what they're considering to be native values. Okay. And this is also being committed by the federal government. This is also being committed by the state government, too. And then you have these white vigilantes that aren't employed by the government at all. And somehow all three of these collective bodies are like they're engaging in violence against European immigrants, against slave populations that appear like they want to revolt, and then against the natives because they're trying to continue pushing out the natives. Okay? So these are the politics of nativism. So now what's happening is European immigrants are coming in, and like I said, after about 2 years or so, they get the right to vote, and they're voting against the expansion of slavery. Many of them are not necessarily saying, hey, we want to eradicate slavery. Most of them are just against the expansion of slavery because they would like to minimize the moral atrocity that's happening to these Black people. They understand that there are white people that are culturally invested in owning other human beings and marginalizing other human beings. And so, on that basis, they're not trying to fundamentally undermine them, but they do to some extent by virtue of their Roman Catholicism from Europe. They believe that the culture of slavery is one that should not be expanded or further invested in. So it creates this unique conflict in which there's this notion that to be a real American is to be pro-slavery. And if somehow you find yourself on the anti-slavery end of the political spectrum, you're not a real American. And so therefore you're like tarnishing American democracy or the sovereignty of American democracy. This would also then start sowing seeds for like gerrymandering, for political, what's the word that I'm looking for? Manipulation of like political laws and who gets the right to vote and who doesn't, these kinds of things. Right. So between the period of about 1846 to 1855, you have approximately 3 million immigrants from Europe, from Ireland, from Germany, from England, from all over that are coming to these new lands. And so part of the expectation is that if they are going to declare citizenship of this new country we're calling the United States of America, then they have to identify as white. Okay. But for these Europeans, what the hell is that? That's just a color, as far as they know. Whiteness is not a thing that existed in Europe. It's this made-up concept that exists in the Americas, and it kind of to these European immigrants, it kind of erases their identity, it erases their culture, it erases their uniqueness because they identify as Irish or Scottish or German or British or French or something like that, right? And so what's happening is uh, while they are forced to adopt this new identity that they're calling white, they are endowing their children with the responsibility of like maintaining their connection to their cultural roots. And so this is how you end up with a group of white people, mostly white people, in modern society who have like no connection to Europe ethnically, culturally, or anything like that, but they'll put emphasis on like, oh, I'm Irish, or I'm French, or I'm German, or I'm Scottish, or something like that. And like I said, they have no cultural connection, but it's almost as if like the identity of American is like a placeholder. And it's a placeholder for being able to insert what your real or authentic ethnic identity is in place of American, because there's this subtle, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like a Freudian admission that American has no meaning. American culture doesn't really exist. Like it's not a real thing. It's like a made up thing. In order for you to truly identify as American, you really do have to be disconnected from your European roots. And so that's why you're calling yourself white. So you have these ethnic groups that are migrating from regions in and around Europe that are like also adding to some form of culture that we still see today, which there is this kind of subtle understanding that like to be American has no meaning. And later on, I'll talk about this. But if you were to ask an American in 2025 today, what is American culture? Many of them would struggle to tell you. What does that mean? What does it mean like culturally, how is the United States of America distinct from other global entities culturally? They'll struggle to tell you. And part of the reason is because the country, culturally speaking, and I'm speaking from the position of an anthropologist when I say this, culturally speaking, the United States of America suffers from this affliction of misunderstanding. And the affliction of misunderstanding here is that what we call a culture in conventional science and conventional wisdom is not something that is forced upon a group of people, but rather naturally emerges. And so, what's happening in this phenomenon, this experiment we're calling the United States of America, is they are trying to distinguish themselves. They are trying to establish themselves as a distinct and unique culture while recruiting a hodgepodge of people belonging to other cultures and then trying to force them to abandon their own customs and ideals and replace it with like an idea. And the idea is really just one that is only an idea. In substance and in practice, what we're calling culture in America is like non-existent. So there are different ways that you can kind of probe the veracity of what I'm saying here, and part of the way that you can probe that is why is there this phenomenon of like Americans feeling obligated to identify with some place else that they may not even have connection to at all next to their American identity, right? There's like a Freudian psychological admission, and if you truly explore what I would loosely describe as your American spirit, you'll kind of see that I'm telling the truth, right? Um, getting back to my point, because I digress, they're trying to force these Europeans to like assimilate into American culture, what they're calling freedom and democracy and liberty, while they're literally denying people freedom, while they're literally genociding people, marginalizing people, displacing them. And many of these Native Americans, they're not just standing around, sitting idly by, and then waiting to get shot in the face and then buried in a hole in the ground. Many of these Native Americans are getting pushed southward. They're getting pushed into the region of Mexico. So this is also why I call who we're calling illegals in this country, and we're primarily targeting the Spanish speakers. They're these the descendants of the indigenous people that originally belonged to these lands. They are the first Americans, and that's how I describe them. And so what's happening is they're forcing Celts, they're forcing Hebrews, they're forcing Mediterraneans, they're forcing all of these different people with different languages, different religions, different identities to somehow abandon all of that in place of a color. And the color they're calling it is you're just white now. Okay, so you can see how that creates tension and turmoil. So what's happening is there are lots of European immigrants that don't want to abandon their cultural distinction or their ethnicity or something like that. And so on that basis, then depending on where they're from and how they feel, you have lots of people who just face discrimination because of this kind of subtle refusal to abandon their ethnicity or their ethnic identity. So you have Irish that are facing discrimination. You have Italians that are facing discrimination. You have Jews that are being lynched too. And so many of these people are also finding themselves alongside African Americans. Maybe some of the African Americans they find themselves, not every single African American in the United States was enslaved, but they were certainly marginalized. And so if you ethnically were born, or like logistically, geographically, you were born in Italy, you were born in Ireland, you were born somewhere in Eastern Europe, and you're a Jew, you find yourself marginalized next to these African Americans who you also see as human beings, because the people that call themselves white, uh, they want you to like abandon your cultural ways and like marginalize these other human beings when you just don't want to. You think it's wrong, and you truly think it's wrong. So you find yourself getting lynched, you find yourself getting discriminated against, you find yourself in a position of poverty, right? In a position of relative unfortunate circumstance, right? And so what's happening is, because there are waves of European migrants and eventually Asian migrants too, I'll talk about Asians in just a moment, that are coming here, and they're bringing these anti-slavery, pro-racial equality sentiments with them. They have these fears that, like, Americans anyway, have these fears that, like, if more of them come, they're a threat to the American way of life. So here, where I've told you that there's like this Freudian admission that American culture is kind of hollow, what we can call American culture, and in the psychology of those who call themselves American, what they truly understand American culture to be is a culture of racial marginalization. It is a culture of consolidating power while explicitly and intentionally denying other people power. And believe it or not, throughout the timeline of American history, that does in fact emerge as the hallmark of what you can qualify as a cultural phenomenon here. Is you have people who identify with a color marginalizing other people and then calling it their culture. So when you hear, for example, people say, "Oh, I'm against gay marriage because, in traditional society, marriage is between a man and a woman." What they're saying is that their culture, part of what they call their culture, is marginalizing you. When you hear white people in the 1940s and 50s and they say, "Oh, oh no, we're against racial segregation, mixing the races is communism, and oh, our culture, our cultural way of life is under siege," and blah, blah, blah. They're telling the truth. Their culture is nothing more than marginalizing other people. So you'll hear this with like Charlie Kirk too, when he talks about, oh, the politics of tradition, and oh, American society and traditional values and religion and blah blah blah. At the core of what he is in fact calling his culture, here he's not lying. This is substantiated by a large body of evidence. What he truly sees as his culture is no one else gets the same rights as he does. And so he's willing to gaslight and lie and discriminate in order to substantiate these things. Getting back to the point here, because I digress. I'm sorry. I keep digressing. By the 1870s, you're getting waves of Chinese immigrants that are appearing on the west coast of the United States. And some of them are appearing in the United States because they're being recruited for work, right? Because what we consider to be manual labor in the United States is kind of known to be the grunt work, right? So maybe you can't afford African slaves in the South, but maybe you can pass word over to the east and say, hey, if you sell to these lands, we'll recruit you, we'll pay you a low wage or something like that. There's also other Chinese people that are being recruited to the Americas purely on the basis that it's a new opportunity, right? And so they start appearing along the West Coast. And then that's adding fuel to the fire of what we're calling nativism here, because these white people see these Chinese immigrants as a threat to notions of American purity and sovereignty, right? That, like, if there's too many Chinese that come over here and we haven't yet developed the West Coast, this is going to become new China. And now we're going to have to fight an American Chinese war for control of this land that God wants to be ours, right? So by 1882, you get Congress passes what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay. The political cartoon you're seeing here perfectly represents the values here. Is they want to build a Chinese wall around the United States of America. Does that sound familiar? Right? They're talking about building a wall in 1882 or around 1882. This was a bill that was passed by Congress, eventually signed by President Chester A. Arthur, and it is trying to restrict immigration. It's basically saying, hey, Chinese people, if you're Chinese, and by Chinese, this would be a loose term to describe anyone who has the monolids, the Iceland, is if you're Chinese or if you look Chinese or something like that, doesn't matter if you're Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, you're Chinese. If you're Chinese, you are restricted from coming to the US for a period of at least 10 years. Okay. And so in that 10 years, that's going to give these white people enough time to develop the land, to populate their numbers, to be able to overrepresent, so that when you start eventually letting in all of these other Chinese immigrants and let them permanently plant roots here, that there's no way that they can outpower or overpower American whites. Okay. So exceptions to the Chinese Exclusion Act was made for like merchants or teachers or students or travelers or diplomats or something like that. And the reason for that is because, yes, oh, great, there's a new style of cooking. We can get access to your food. Maybe there's things we can learn. You can help us to legitimize our culture and take your experiences back to your land. But you cannot own property here. You can't live here. You can't be here unless you're kind of like you're here for an employment related purpose. There's no way you can be here. So immigration policy and immigration, or at least trying to enforce the immigration of these immigration policy here, is explicitly about restricting the immigration of people who are not white. So fast forward to 1924, and you get Congress passing what would eventually become the Immigration Act of 1924. This is what's called the Johnson-Reed Act. Okay, and the Johnson-Reed Act basically tries to like bottleneck immigration from Asia, like restrict immigration from Asia altogether, and then to set quotas on who gets to come from specific parts of the country. And in terms of Europe, they restricted the number of people who could come in from Eastern and Southern Europe to 3%. Okay, so imagine you have a boat full of hundreds of people that have been sailing over the Atlantic Ocean for weeks, if not months, right? And then they get to the other side, and only 3% of the entire boat population is actually let into the country. Okay, that's going to create a thing where like people are starting to like jump over, because what you're not going to do is you're not going to have people on a boat for months on end and then turn them back around to go months all the way back to where they came from. So many people were just like, oh, they're going to send us back, fuck that. And then they start jumping over the boats, they start swimming to the shores. And what can these people do? They don't have like any kind of law enforcement, they don't have anything. So the Johnson-Reed Act is trying to address this unprecedented phenomenon they're calling illegal immigration, where they're trying to keep out as many Europeans as they can. Ultimately, these people are white. So they're trying to let in Europeans, but they don't want too many Europeans because the Europeans appear to like see the humanity of these black people and are constantly advocating for like racial equality and freedom. And so they don't want that. They don't want that. So you bottleneck it. And so in bottlenecking it, what you also don't want is you don't want an influx of people that are jumping off of the boats and swimming to the shores. So the United States government passes a bill that creates what's called the Border Patrol, which we still then have today. Okay. And so the State Department is absolutely they're quoted, they go on record, they go on document, and they're saying, no, the purpose of this bill, the purpose of this is to preserve the ideal of U.S. homogeneity. We don't want too many Europeans. We don't want Japanese. We don't want Chinese. We don't want Korean. We don't want anyone, no Mexican, no nothing other than American. And again, what they're calling American is an overrepresentation of white people who do not have any affiliation or connection to any other lands. But the notion of what it means to be American belongs to these white people. And so, on that basis, they're trying to control immigration in a racial way. It's not just about coming here legally, it's about what kind of immigrant are you? Fast forward to the eve of World War II, and you have Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, and he's basically issuing an executive order to prevent all government agencies from hiring without discrimination, or not to prevent, but rather to encourage them to hire without discrimination, because the United States of America is going to war with the Nazis. And part of the reason why they're going to war with the Nazis is because Nazi Germany, believe it or not, actually learned from how the US persecutes its black people, that if it wants to get rid of a specific racial minority, all it has to do is commit political genocide. And so the Nazis are committing political genocide against Jews, who the United States sees as a kind of white person. And so, on that basis, the United States is then going to war. Okay, going to war to save the Jews in the exact same way that it will not go to war to save brown Middle Eastern Muslims who are being persecuted by Jewish Israelis in the year 2025. So you can kind of think about that, right? So FDR is basically saying, hey, hire without discrimination because we need to mass produce planes, we need to mass produce guns, ammo, rations, uniforms, anything in order for us to win the war. And so what that's incentivizing is, because slavery at this particular time is eradicated, it motivates a mass migration of African Americans away from the rural South and into these industrialized northern regions because they get better pay. The work is basically guaranteed. So you have lots of African Americans that are migrating away from the South and into the North. Okay. And so because they're not being discriminated against for better pay, that's going to create that incentive. But the problem is that then that leaves behind a shortage of labor in agriculture in the South. That you have lots of rural white people who, for hundreds of years, have had niggers running their fields and growing their crops and picking their cotton. These white people don't want to go out into the fields and do the work that niggers have been doing for over 250 years. Why the hell do they need to do that? Right? So they start pressuring the government, like, you need to find a fix here. And if you're not going to find a fix, then we're just going to stop growing crops altogether. Well, because the United States wants to win the war, especially against the Nazis, then they have to figure out a way to try to allocate manual labor back into these agricultural societies. So what they end up creating by 1942, literally overlapping World War II, is the Bracero program, or the manual laborer program, okay, where they are recruiting Mexican farm workers, the same quote unquote Mexicans who are the descendants of the natives that were kicked out of the land if they weren't killed, are the same ones they're hiring to work the fields and the railroads that African Americans were working until FDR's executive order, right? So between 1942 and 1964, you get roughly 5 million Mexican braceros that are being imported into the South to work the fields. Okay. And so they're doing their jobs and they're doing them efficiently. But eventually, what happens is you have Mexican farm workers that are having children, And then they're having children, and those children are then qualified to be American citizens. And then, in addition to being qualified to be American citizens, their stay is temporary, it's not permanent. And so, what's happening is you have lots of braceros who are just overstaying the terms of their limits and they're getting paid under the table. And then you have a group of people who maybe they didn't get into the bracero program, but that doesn't mean they'll be turned away if they just show up to a landowner's door and say, "Hey, I didn't get into the bracero program, but if you pay me a little bit, I'm still willing to work." So what's happening is the bracero program opens up this like Pandora's box for what would eventually be called illegal immigration. Right now, no one considers it to be illegal because no one's bothered. You need the help. You need the manual labor on these farms, and these people are willing to do it. And so just let them cross the border. If they want to cross the border and get in, at least white people don't have to go out and pick all these crops or anything like that. Okay. So what ends up happening is by 1950, you get so many Mexican quote unquote migrants. Again, I will insist to you that they are the descendants of the people who originally inhabited this land. So when I call them migrants, I am using colonizers' language to say this. I do not believe they are migrants myself. Um, you have these Mexican migrants, they become so populated in the South that like white people are becoming threatened by the prevalence of Spanish speaking people, these brown people that are outnumbering them. There's too many of these Mexican migrants in the South. And if we want to do what we can to make sure that we can maintain white control over these lands, then we need to start deporting them. So they launched what's called Operation Wetback. This only lasted 4 years. The terminology here, first of all, wetback is in fact a derogatory term. The equivalent you might want to think about is this could be the equivalent of calling it Operation Nigger. Okay. And so the point is you're using military tactics, if you can, to try to kick out as many of these Mexican migrants as you possibly can. But the problem here is that there are so many Mexican migrants, or Spanish speakers rather, that like some of them really are American citizens. Some of them who are getting deported are American citizens. So they get captured, arrested, put on a bus, and then shipped out to Mexico. And then Mexico is shipping them right back to the US because they're American citizens, right? Or you have people that are getting captured by law enforcement, arrested, but they actually had legal papers to work these fields. And then you have a group of people that still are not getting captured and are undocumented. So it's like this clusterfuck where like somehow what we're now calling illegal entry into the United States is really just driven by a desire not to have too many Mexicans. When they were all working the fields and their populace was quote unquote under control, nobody had a problem. But because there is a perceived threat to notions of whiteness, one of the things that is being leveraged to try to exile these people is are they documented or not? And if they're undocumented, well, then it's illegal, right? Okay. Fast forward to 1965. I know the timeline of history is always more complicated. Yes, I could speak to that complexity, but if I did so, I would be going on forever and ever. So you'll have to give me grace in that regard. Fast forward to 1965, where you have the passing of the Immigration and Nationality Act. That was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And the idea here was by 1965, there was this kind of colloquial understanding that what we're calling a white American pretty much represents the statistical majority in virtually every corner of the continental United States. And so, because of this, they're basically ending their legally enforced quotas around how many people from what country can come to the United States. And so the signing of this bill allowed for up to 20,000 qualified immigrants, qualified in quotations here, qualified immigrants to come from any country without restriction. And so, yes, with the signing of this bill, you had an increase in immigration from Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. But because Mexicans are right next door, and because many of them are the descendants of those who were native to this land, it also increases the number of undocumented migrants that are coming into the US from Mexico, too. And part of the reason is because you have these landowners, farm laborers, these people in these agricultural regions that are finding that they can get extremely cheap labor from these Mexicans that they can't get from slaves because slavery was eradicated, right? So the people that are paying these Mexican migrants or incentivizing quote unquote illegal immigration are generally the people that are offering these people steady paid employment. Okay. Fast forward to 1986, and you still have a group of people, businesses, corporations, hotels, multi-million dollar entities that are all benefiting from cheap labor by hiring undocumented, quote unquote, migrants, right? Because they can pay them a lower wage than what is legally enforceable at any given point in time. So it's still incentivizing an influx of undocumented migration from people south of the border. And so what's happening is you're still, even though laws are getting passed to try to like restrict illegal or undocumented migration, you're still getting like a prevalent number of Spanish speaking brown people that are showing up and they're doing agricultural work, they're doing horticulture work, they're showing up at like hardware stores looking to get hired for temporary positions. And again, the only thing that's driving this notion that they're like a threat to American society is like white people who are just scared of being surrounded by people speaking a language they don't understand. None of these people are coming into the country committing crimes or rape or anything like that. They're all just trying to find steady employment, right? So fast forward to 1986, and you get the Immigration Reform and Control Act signed by Ronald Reagan. And Reagan, at this point, he recognizes that like there's no way, it's impossible to somehow round up like all of these people, arrest them, deport them. It's like a clusterfuck. There's no way. In order for that to be successful, you would have to, the out migration of these people would have to somehow be higher than their in migration, which is just not happening. And no matter how much you try to gather up as many people as you possibly can, that's not going to stop them from still coming. It doesn't matter if you build a wall. It doesn't matter if you try to enforce laws and institutions or anything like that. So Ronald Reagan is basically trying to hit a soft reset button. And in this soft reset button, he's basically saying, okay, any undocumented migrants who are in the country prior to January 1st, 1984, you can stay in the United States as a permanent resident. You'll pay taxes. You'll have access to a certain tier of benefits or things like that. But for all intents and purposes, you will be a legal resident of the United States, but you just won't be able to vote and things like that. And so this bill also made it illegal to knowingly hire undocumented immigrants. The problem with this is that the stigma around immigration is focused solely on the brown people and not the white people that are incentivizing their quote unquote illegal immigration. Although I personally do not believe that their immigration is illegal. And I'll tell you why in a few slides. So prior to the signing of this bill, there were lots of debates going on about like, why should we allow these people into the country? And like, oh, they're just going to steal jobs. And oh, if you're allowing them to be permanent residents of the United States, then oh, they're just going to overuse the welfare system, and many of them are just lazy, and oh, they're unwilling to assimilate to American culture. All they want to do is just come here and speak Spanish, not realizing that Spanish is a European colonizer's language. But then more importantly, if you ask the American layperson what American culture actually is, they generally could not tell you. They do not see American culture in the way that I defined it to you a few minutes ago. It's this nebulous notion of like freedom and liberty. But then even that can be kind of replied with, but what is Donald Trump doing legislatively to undermine the notions of American freedom? He's taking away rights, not expanding them, right? So it's things like this where like the politics around the passing of this bill really is just about debating the threat, the perceived threat of these brown Spanish speaking people. But once you unpack these ideas, it kind of falls apart. And I'll talk about this in a few slides. Um, so what's happening is the bill passes. Ronald Reagan passes the bill. It goes through, and more Mexican quote unquote immigrants are becoming permanent settlers. And then by virtue of becoming permanent settlers, their children then are eligible to become citizens in the United States. And then by virtue of that, they can recruit more family members. It just becomes a thing where like the racialized fears around these black Spanish speaking or black Spanish brown Spanish speaking people who, again, they're brown because they're Native American. They're the first Americans. They speak Spanish because they were colonized by Spanish speaking Europeans. They're seen as like otherworldly. And so people start painting them as such. And there's this idea that like, oh, they're just going to come here and they're going to rape and oh, they commit crimes and oh, they're killers. And oh, Donald Trump in the modern era is saying, oh, they're eating your cats and dogs, right? So you have like decades, waves of just angry white people who are upset that like, oh, maybe you did have that one-off case where you had a migrant who was undocumented and ended up committing murder or something like that. But now this one-off case somehow represents like the entire population of people for some reason. So by 1996, you get the Illegal Immigration Reform and Responsibility Act, right? And they are trying to deny, like, do what they can to deny these people access by virtue of being permanent residents of the United States. If you're undocumented, you do not have access to social services. If you're undocumented, you cannot send your children to school. If you're undocumented, you cannot buy a house. If you're undocumented, you cannot own a business. They're trying to like undermine these people being able to like create stable lives for themselves purely on the basis that like they just don't have papers. And around the politics of their paperwork really is, it's just codified language for like brown people, right? One of the signs that you see here, in addition to dehumanizing them by calling them aliens, there's one sign, this veteran's hat is kind of blocking it, but if we were to guesstimate what the sign said, it says, Congress welcomes diseased, illegal, alien criminals, right? They're doing what they can. Like these angry white conservatives are like trying to dehumanize these brown people and then use their dehumanization of these brown people to stigmatize the fact that they were not natural born citizens of the United States. When you unpack a lot of their arguments, they fall apart. And I'll do so in like 2 slides, and then we'll open it up for questions. But you get this kind of sentiment. So these sentiments of like waving an American flag, being a white person who's like towing the line between what it is to be an American and like subtly exposing this belief that like what it means to be American is to be white and to not be anything else and denying certain privileges, it kind of follows in a sort of echo chamber down the timeline of American history. Fast forward to now you're starting to get political ads stigmatizing the border. I would play this video, but I'm running out of time, and I do want to be time efficient, and I want to give enough time for people to ask questions. So I won't be playing this video. However, this video is an ad run in 1994 by governor candidate Pete Wilson, who's basically characterizing Mexican migrants as being like welfare moochers and opportunity stealers, and they're thugs and criminals. And you can read more about it in this book called How Immigration Became Illegal by Aviva Chomsky. But essentially, you have like a cultural phenomenon in which there are Americans that are susceptible to the rhetoric of racial fear and animosity. And so because as long as you can direct racialized fear and animosity to brown people, to black people, to people who are not white, you will always have those group of people who identify as American or identify as white who are like susceptible to it. Sorry, I won't play the video, but you can look it up for yourself. I don't want to play the video. Anyway, last point to be made here, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'm sorry I keep going over, but hopefully this is interesting enough to keep you. Um, a lot of the anti-immigration arguments are incredibly weak. And part of the reason for that is because on an intellectual level, you have to understand that race is a fictitious concept, that a border is a fictitious concept that nature and the laws of the universe does not recognize. And so, because nature or the universe does not see a distinction between one kind of human from another, it means then that when we narrow on the politics of those other people in comparison to ourselves, or like us versus them, they're really rooted in a misunderstanding of like the laws of nature. Okay, that there really is, despite the fact that these other people do in fact speak a different language, or maybe they belong to a different religion, or they're from a different region, they're still human. And so any legislative policy that stigmatizes any one kind of human, believe it or not, does a thing where it stigmatizes all humans, right? And so there are several arguments that are recurring. A lot of them you can hear Charlie Kirk and his conservative ilk kind of parrot a lot of the time. But they'll say things like, oh, we like immigrants. We love immigrants. We love people from different places, but just come the legal way. There's a legal process, right? But when you unpack that, you could ask an American, for example, what is the legal way? Like, what is the process? They almost never have an answer. And there's not just one way to become a legal citizen. There's like multiple pathways, but because they're kind of defaulting to this nebulous idea that there's a legal way that they have no knowledge of. It's a way in which they try to sound credible and valid around saying, "Oh, we love immigrants," but when you unpack it, really, it's just a form of xenophobia. And then, more importantly, for those Americans who do understand what the legal way is, many of them don't grasp just how difficult it is to legally come here if you were born in another land, right? There are lots of people who try to come to the United States and get hired or find work or something like that. It's incredibly difficult, and I would encourage you to go do a basic internet search and look up the pathways to U.S. citizenship. And if you can't speak to any qualified individual, just ask AI a neutral question. How difficult is it to become a US citizen legally? And then watch the kinds of answers it gives you. Okay. More importantly, a lot of Americans are not aware of like the lethal real world circumstances that may motivate so-called illegal immigration. Maybe you're being politically persecuted in the land that you're coming from, and you don't have time for a bureaucratic process, right? You just don't have time for it. And so most Americans don't care about that. They think that like if somebody is pointing a gun to your head or they're shooting people down in the streets, that like you have time to submit paperwork and then wait for 10 years. Then around this notion of like, oh, they're just like lazy welfare moochers. Somehow there's this idea that they're both collecting the welfare and they're also taking the jobs. Like, which is it? It can't be both. You can't both be a lazy immigrant who just wants to mooch off of tax dollars while simultaneously also taking the jobs. Once you examine this a little bit closer, you realize it really is just racist xenophobia. Okay. Another argument, oh, it's not about where you're coming from. It's not about the fact that they're coming from Mexico. We feel the same way about anybody coming from European countries too. And yet, ICE is only targeting people of color and mainly only the Spanish speakers, right? And then if you were to talk to any undocumented white immigrants, if you somehow have the privilege of being able to talk with these people, most of them will explicitly tell you that they are aware that they don't have anything to be afraid of, even though they're undocumented and they're in the country, quote unquote, illegally, because they're white. So, like, there's this casual admission, even among white undocumented immigrants, that, like, this really is about race and racism. Like, it has nothing to do with anything other than kicking out these brown people because they're a threat to notions of American whiteness. Then you have who would then become the president, Donald Trump, going on television and then saying, yeah, Mexicans are rapists and killers and murderers, and they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. oh, you're probably gonna have terrorists from the Middle East. You're probably gonna have terror. He's like appealing to racialized notions that on their own, on its own, a president of the United States should understand that the politics around immigration is a lot more complicated than just appealing to these like straw man racist stereotypes. But then, if that's not enough for you, the "it's not about where you're from" argument also falls apart with photographic evidence. Because here you can see pictures. On the right, this is your common picture of like the US Mexico border. They've got walls, they've got a gate erected, they have Border Patrol regularly making rounds around the area. But then, if we compare the US Mexico border to the US Canada border, you will see that there are large plots of land around the US Canada border where it's completely unguarded. Okay. Where like literally you have people walking their dogs along the US Canada border, and the US Canada border is just more or less a trench. There's no gates, there's no nothing. At one point, I know of, the US Canada border goes through somebody's living room, right? And nobody's saying, oh, these illegal immigrants, they're coming from Canada and blah. And I can guarantee you, these people are quote unquote illegally crossing into the United States all the time because they can, and because nobody's stigmatizing their migration into the United States, which means just on statistical plausibility, you have a large number of white people that are leaving Canada undocumented and then coming into the United States and are here, quote unquote, illegally, but they know they're safe and they will admit to you that they know they're safe because they're white. Something to think about. Then there's the argument of, oh, well, why don't you just fix your own country? Why can't you just stick around in your own country and make it better? Why do you have to bring all of your ways over here? And part of the problem is you have people that pretend like any one individual is just capable of revolutionizing their country, right? Most people are not don't have the political power to just be able to like turn their country around 180 degrees. So most Americans are not only like ignorant of their own political systems and political histories, but they're ignorant of the people who they're talking about when they say, "Oh, just fix your own country." Then you have the argument of, "Oh, no, it's not about Mexicans, it's not about Canada or Canadians. It's about getting the criminals. We just want to get the criminals." But then the problem is most of the undocumented people that are currently being rounded up by ICE don't have a criminal record of any kind. ICE is showing up to like job sites. Do you realize that? Like people who are diligent, hard workers, those are the people you're going after. They're not criminals. Now, yeah, I mean, sure, if there's somebody who's found guilty, there's evidence that they've been guilty of rape or murder or something like that, and then you want to deport them, sure. But Kilmar Abrego Garcia, like it's like low-hanging fruit. And the only rational explanation for it, the one they don't want to admit, is that this is about race politics. And the race politics is an extension of their culture because this is their culture. Their culture norm, their cultural way of life is stigmatizing other people and denying them equality. Okay. Then you have this argument. I've heard Charlie Kirk make this one. Oh, we're removing them humanely. Oh, but here's Donald Trump proposing to deport people to a non-native country that's located on a different continent. We call it Uganda. So you're going to take Venezuelans, you're going to take people who might illegally migrate from Cuba and then send them to Africa, and then you're calling that humane. Does that even make any sense? Then, oh, well, we want to make sure that they're not bringing diseases, right? So now we're reducing the humanity of these people to like being a vector for disease or pretending that like somehow the United States is like diseaseless. Does that make any sense to you? A lot of the anti-immigrant sentiments, I'm screen sharing has stopped. I'm going to be opening up uh, start video. Um, a lot of the sentiments that you see here, it's hollow. The moment you closely unpack and examine anything around this notion of xenophobia, immigration, illegal immigration, the only thing that survives is that really this is just about racism. And it's very easy to expose that. It's not something that you need to debate about. Okay. I'm sorry for taking an extra 10 or 15 minutes or so. You are now free to open up your video, unmute yourself if you would like to. I'd like to open up the forum to questions of any kind. Hi, Monica. Welcome back.
Hello.
Hi there. Yeah, do you have a question for me? Like I said, apologies for going a little bit over, but I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, no worries. I was just wondering a bit because I know I've seen and I had seen only a little bit on this, but not, and wondering if you knew a little bit more about it. Kind of the phenomenon around like older immigrants having basically being prejudiced against new immigration and
Mhm.
things like that, and kind of what that's about. Like, I don't know if it's kind of relating into like the historical aspects that you were talking about earlier, and that trying to be assimilating and proving that they're American, or what's kind of going on there. So I was just curious your thoughts on that.
So that's always going to be complicated to an extent, right? One individual's motivations for their own behavior is not necessarily reflective of others. At the same time, you have this interesting phenomenon where there are people who, for their own individual level pressures, they want access to the benefits that the American dream or the American promise is offering them, and because there is such a highly politicized contention around who gets access to those benefits, because they're already here, they want to toe the line by going, I'm the exception, just close the door on those people. And so what ends up happening is they embody this politic in which they're the people who shut the door behind them, right? Um, but it's complicated. That doesn't necessarily represent everybody. But I would say that there are a lot of people who are genuinely motivated by, well, if you're going to kick out anybody, just don't kick me out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just seems so, of course, counterintuitive because, of course, they will have immigrated and gone through the process and all that kind of stuff, whether it was a delightful, process in that self or not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, no worries.
Linda,
Hi,
Linda,
I'm
hi.
here. Sorry, just I usually use Teams and not Zoom, so it always takes me a minute to like figure
Yeah.
out where everything is.
Oh no,
Uh,
take your time. It's okay.
Thank you for another really great lecture. There's so much to unpack. The first thing I wanted to say was you had said something earlier. I'm pretty sure you were being facetious when you said we went to war in World War II to save the Jews. And yeah, so I just wanted to note that there was quotas for immigration by European Jews in the years for European Jews leading up to the years prior to World War II, and the United States actually turned away um, immigrants and refugees, some of them who went on to die in concentration camps because we didn't. Well, I think the mythology of us, jumping into World War II to save, the world against Hitler happened post World War II, but I think it was mostly because Japan bombed us at Pearl Harbor, and then the other Axis powers immediately declared war against us once we declared war against Japan.
Yeah, so part of what led up to that was American troops, I believe, were scattered all around Europe, and there weren't enough resources to be able to respond to Japan. I know there was ongoing trade relationships between the US and Japan, and the US kept saying that if you were going to be allied with the Nazis or allied with the Axis powers, that we're going to cut off our trade relationship with you. And then they eventually did so, which then led to Japan bombing Pearl Harbor, and then because the US effectively had no other alternative way to respond, dropped an atomic bomb and an H bomb, and then turned its attention right back to Europe. In terms of the Jews, I was absolutely being facetious. That was it. Part of it, okay, so if you hear me, part of it is Nazi Germany, um, prior to actually committing genocide against the Jews, had adopted many of its anti Jewish sentiments and values from the United States. That much is absolutely true. Um, I am of the retrospective opinion, although there's no one in modern history will say the US went to World War II because it wanted to save the Jews because they're white. But in retrospect, part of it is if the Nazis were doing these things to the Jews because the Americans were doing it to black people, these same things to black people, and then you go to war with the Jews, and now here we are in Israel versus Palestine history, and we have to observe the United States, which obviously, by extension of the politics of Donald Trump, is a little unique. But even prior to the election of Donald Trump, we're still not leaning into a politically consistent response with the persecution of Jews during World War II. What's the reason for it? And I would say that while it is speculation, there is a perfectly valid potential explanation in admitting that it's because the Jews are a kind of white person, anthropologically speaking. And given the history of 9/11, given the fact that most of the Palestinians, some of whom are Christian, but most of whom are Muslim and are brown, there is a lack of empathy that motivates a politically consistent response. And so on that basis, one could retrospectively opine that part of the motive to liberate Europe from Nazi imperialism was motivated by race. And in fact, when the US went into Europe with its armed forces, it went in with a segregated army. So race politics is inevitably at the center of it. But yes, I was being facetious. Any other question?
I have one other thing to say.
Yeah. Please.
Jumping to a different topic, but related. When we were talking about we weren't talking about asylum, but we were talking about immigration into the United States and the proper process and what that looks like and how difficult it is. I wanted to note that up until recently, I think the current administration, one of the ways that you could immigrate to the United States was through the asylum process, through the affirmative asylum process, which you have a better chance of doing and you could apply for at the border or once you're within the United States.
Yes.
So that's an incentive for people to come to the border and apply, or be if you're within the United States for at least a year, you can also apply. Those were the rules prior to this administration. So of course, that's going to incentivize people to come and do that. So you can't say do it the right way when we tell people that this is what you can do, and then say once they go to their hearings, round them up and move them around in several different detention centers.
Yes, you're correct. I talk about this in my class. I can only give an abridged version here for the sake of convenience, right? But I have slides on this. And for the sake of time, I wanted to keep in things that added substance, but there were things I had to be selective about. But we specifically talk about how in order to seek asylum in the United States, part of the eligibility for being able to apply for asylum requires you to be in the United States undocumented. The reason for that is because although we don't know the individual circumstance of every person who ends up undocumented, part of the reason it goes to this quote unquote extreme is because you might be a victim of political persecution that is fleeing a lethal circumstance. And so your first obligation is to get to safety. And so being a shining beacon on a hill that we position ourselves as, we are the land of safety, of law and order, and get here first. And then when you get here, then after a period of time, you've got your stability and everything, apply for asylum. And then you have a group of angry, mostly white people who call themselves conservative that are then saying it's quote unquote illegal immigration. And again, this is more of like an emotional sentiment, not a literal or a logical one. Because there was nothing illegal about it. The only thing that makes the immigration illegal, quote unquote, is if they overstay their time period to a point where they're not documented and they have no intention of doing so, which is the equivalent of like a parking ticket, and not, or your parking ticket expire, or your parking meter expiring, not you've committed a felony that requires us to devote billions of dollars to extricating you to a completely different continent than the one that's right next door. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Any other questions in the Zoom session here? You're not obligated to speak up, and you don't have to turn on your mic or anything. But if you're interested in asking a question, I'd invite you to do so. Also, if you are listening on the lecture hall live stream right now, maybe you've submitted a question. I'm now looking for questions that were submitted in the chat. If you have a question, I'm taking questions here too. I don't see any questions at this particular moment in time, but what I will say on the topic of like xenophobia and kicking out the people and trying to get them here the legal way and things like that is in the resources on my Patreon. I attached a PDF of an academic article published in 2022 that kind of this scholar goes and interviews either self-appointed volunteer militias that run patrol on the border, or they're just people who really just want to keep out Mexicans and Mexican migrants. And this author lists a specific set of recurring themes in her interviews with these people. And many of the themes are things like the things you'll hear Charlie Kirk say, for example, just come here legally. We're not anti-immigrant. We're just pro-legality. Or, it's not about where you're from. We like people from everywhere. Or, oh, just don't bring any diseases. There are like recurring themes. And when you closer examine the rhetoric around these ideas, the logic of these ideas falls apart. And the only thing that you're left with that is logically consistent is pro-white, anti-black and brown racism. This is why you'll hear Charlie Kirk appeal to notions of Muslims not being compatible with the West, why we don't want immigrants from Haiti, you'll hear him say. You'll hear him say things like we don't want Mexicans unless they're eligible for work or something like that. You'll hear him say these things because a lot of his attention, a lot of the negative interpretations of the ideas of his rhetoric is anti-black and brown. And then if you pin him on this, he'll quickly deny it. But that's a form of gaslighting. And it's unfortunate that a lot of these views, it's not like Charlie Kirk is an anomaly. A lot of these views truly are, believe it or not, a reflection of what we collectively call American culture. That the consistent factors throughout the timeline of American history in these United States of America is a culture that has evolved around political persecution. And there are, in fact, people that are culturally invested in that political persecution. And so the ideas and the rhetoric that they align themselves with are consistent as such. And they're not lying to you when they tell you, this is my culture. These are my values. I want to protect my traditional values. You can condense it down to my traditional values is that you don't get the same rights and freedoms as me. And they're not lying. Are there any questions in the chat? Perhaps somebody listening here in the live stream on IG has a question. There aren't very many questions today. Is there any experiences or perspectives that someone in the Zoom session would like to share?
I just wanted to say, I find it interesting when we talk about this notion of persecution. You did say persecution just now, but I think earlier what you said was, okay, cultural way of life is stigmatizing others and denying their rights, right? That's the American culture. Yes. But I think that if you talk So, and this is a part that I find frustrating and very difficult um, to navigate, is that I think that if you were to talk um, to just about, any regular white person that wasn't out there saying specifically, oh, I'm trying to protect my culture, or, specifically that, I don't think Black and brown people should have rights or Muslims should have rights, but that may find themselves leaning into this idea of traditional culture and traditional values. They don't even know what they're saying or what they're talking about, but they feel the need to align themselves with that and lean into that. But I'm not even sure that they know or they can articulate what that is, but
No.
that they're holding on tightly to it. So
Yes.
how do you navigate that space?
That's a difficult question. I think I personally have had very few opportunities in which I have had to navigate that kind of space, and yet I'm keenly aware of it. Um, as an anthropologist, the best I can say is that a legitimate culture is not one that is consciously constructed, intentionally developed. It simply emerges, it simply happens, right? And so the American experiment is built on this notion of getting a country for yourself and then giving that country a culture. And so the mechanisms that are rooted in the act of giving that country a culture attempts to bypass how cultures actually establish themselves. So what ends up happening is the intentional component, the artificial component is freedom and liberty and justice. And they would try to say that these are hallmarks of American culture. But the problem is then naturally you would still have to explain why people in America who were in these lands just as long as the white people were never had them, right? So that isn't American culture. The only consistent cultural component that, believe it or not, is actually accidental is the one in which we're constantly denying certain people access to the culture. Does that make sense? The culture we still haven't defined, the culture we still don't even really know how to define, is the one we're trying to deny other people access to. So you end up creating a culture over the course of 250 years around marginalization and oppression. So then when I say, as an anthropologist, American culture is marginalization and oppression, it is capitalism, but capitalism is economic marginalization and oppression, right? It's like a thing where I can say this, and so to a conservative, it's oh, you're a Marxist. Oh, you're a communist. Oh, no, I'm not. I'm not endorsing anybody. I'm literally telling you from an anthropological perspective that if you look at the timeline, 250 years of American history, the only thing you can rightly call American culture is political persecution. That's it. And that's anything that anyone who's traditionally conservative and finds themselves on the conservative end of the political spectrum, the only thing they have to protect within their culture is denying other people equal rights. That's literally it. That's the only thing that we have. So there's a lack of understanding that the United States of America really has been an experiment. It's not like France. It's not like Germany. It's not like Japan or Uganda or Nigeria or something like that, or Ethiopia. It's distinct in that it is a group of people who consciously decided to break off, separate themselves, and in so doing, find themselves in a cultural void. And so, what do you do as human beings in a cultural void? You can try to create a culture, but in creating the culture, you're inevitably met with who belongs to the culture and who doesn't. And so, then naturally, what happens is this kind of sequelae. The sequelae is Well, who belongs to the culture and who doesn't? Well, they don't. And then your culture then becomes they don't get access, they don't get blah, blah, blah. And you still haven't even established a culture for yourself. You're saying something, but you're on mute.
No, I was saying that's very interesting. And then I said, wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so here's the other thing then. There is Asian American culture, African American culture, Latin American culture, right? Because you have other people that are maintaining connection to the things, the values they inherited from thousands of years ago. And even for African Americans who are disconnected from their African roots, the conditions of their circumstance forced them to adapt and so develop a collective identity that, yes, is artificially constructed, but that happened as a product of their circumstance. It wasn't forcefully constructed. So, what happens is every aspect of identity around that of American actually has a culture, but American culture is actually non existent. And by technicality, by proxy, white culture is therefore non-existent. So like in my classes, I always have my students do a thing where they explore what it means to be them. And unfortunately, I didn't have enough people. Maybe one week, if enough people, if I can get enough people to consistently show up, I'll try to run a special session where we don't lecture, but we'll do the same exercises my students do. But what I have my students do is I have them racially segregate. I do this for a purpose down the line too, but they all racially segregate, and amongst themselves, they talk about what it means to belong to their racial identity. What does it actually mean to be you? And for better or worse, be racist. What are the stereotypes? What are the good things too? But avoid the language of, oh, we're strong, we're resilient, we're smart, because everybody can say that about themselves. What does it mean to belong to your racial identity in conjunction or contrast to somebody else's? And so naturally, what always happens is the white people struggle. They don't know. I mean, they know stereotypes. They know like whiteness is like political power. Maybe you have a chip on your shoulder. Maybe you don't perceive authority. I have sound clips, believe it or not. In the weeks to come, I'll be uploading little sound clips as reels of some of the things my students say. And they're not trying to be persecutory, they're exploring their own identity. But what happens is inevitably all the time, and I never tell them what to say, they say this on their own. They're always saying whiteness is like we're uncultured. So you know this. You know this. It's not like I'm just making this up out of nowhere. It's that somehow in the American experiment and in this attempt to center whiteness as what it means to be American, you, not you, because not my students, I don't think my students are collectively responsible for this, but somehow the timeline of white history focused so much on denying other people that it forgot itself. And so now here we are in 2025, where now I want to talk about what it means to belong to American culture. And it's always a thing where my students never can. What does that mean? Well, the Black people can say, well, yeah, in the context of slavery, in the context of Jim Crow, in the context of here's how we adapted, here's how we evolved. Latin Americans are going, yeah, in the context of deportation, in the context of Spanish Inquisition, in the context of blah, blah, blah. Asian Americans are going, yeah, in the context of immigration, in the context of the Chinese Exclusion Act, in the context of World War II, in the context of blah, blah, blah. And then white Americans are going, we're uncultured. No, yeah. I mean, see? And it's a weird thing to explore because I don't think there has been any conscious outside of my classroom. I cannot speak to what other people are talking about in their classes, but to my knowledge, there is not much conscious discussion around the fact that white American culture did not actually establish a culture for itself. It never did. Well, it did, but I mean, like in the kind of ethnic way that others have developed a culture. The only culture white Americans and therefore conservative political pundits can point to is you don't get the same rights as me. Um, I saw a question. Somebody says, "Hey, professor, as a grad of Rutgers University, I appreciate your dialogue. I play your clips in response in my barbershop for clients to have dialogue over." Thank you so much. Actually, coincidentally, I'm going to assume your name is Zane because that's a part of your username. Zane, when I was in grad school, when I was doing my dissertation research, I was regularly going to barbershops. Um, uh, if anyone is familiar with Seattle and they know of Earl's Cuts and Styles in the Central District, shout out to them. They're really great. Feel free to go and support that business if you're in the Seattle area. Go to them and don't say, "Hey, do you guys know Julius?" If you go in there and you make mention of me, say, "Do you remember a guy named Resilience?" Because that's what they called me. And they'll have stories to share about that. Caleb Moses asked the question, where do we go from here to improve? I think, first of all, the future is limitless. So that's a question that it's just in the nature of exploration that we're going to have to explore these kinds of things. Um, oh, here's Caleb. Okay, I'm assuming you're the one who asked that question. Okay, you're driving, but I see your video. Um, it's it's difficult to say where we go from here because I don't think to some extent we are all riding the vehicle of the present moment, right? And so it's difficult for us to say. I think at some point in the present moment, it looks like Donald Trump is taking us in the direction of a civil war.
Yeah.
It looks like there's a threat to the Constitution and to notions of American sovereignty as a geopolitical entity, as its own independent nation, right? And so um, I would say there's lots of directions that we could go, but I believe that if we are going to turn the page on the legacy of the Confederacy hijacking the government, on the legacy of white supremacy, on the legacy of racial inequality, a promising future for the country to turn its direction is going to be leveraging racial awareness for the cultivation, excuse me, the intentional cultivation of equality. We have to understand that equality is not accidental. And because America, as an experiment, is a hodgepodge of multiple cultures, backgrounds, faces, languages, religions, beliefs, etc., in order for us to stop plaguing ourselves with the weight of racial inequality and therefore anti humanitarian inequality, we need to understand that it is not going to be an accident for the United States of America to establish itself as the actual land of the free, the actual land of justice and equality, and that in order for us to do it, it requires a collective effort, but it also requires intentionality. And intentionality means identifying those groups that are, in fact, historically marginalized and have never received restitution for it. I'm not just talking about a paycheck. Restitution can also be in communities. It can be legislative restitution. It can be how you give Americans universal access to healthcare. It can be about making sure that there is relative wealth
No.
equality across the country. Those kinds of things, we have to be intentional about that. Otherwise, we're just going to keep repeating the past. And right now, the past is repeating. And I would go so far as to say what's happening symbolically in the government is really just a symptom of the Confederacy took over the government, and we're just witnessing the Confederacy part two. Caleb, would you like to say something?
Well, I appreciate you, inviting me to your platform and giving me the opportunity to speak. Yeah, because I mean, you know, being a black person in America, I even have to correct my parents on some of the stuff they be saying, because not everybody chose to be here from the beginning, but it doesn't give you a right to look down on anybody. We're all equal, and it seems like you have to almost go out of your way to learn the history of the past sins, the way that things are being repeated now because legislation is making it real difficult to, actually learn about the atrocities of the white supremacists and, not dismantling those uh, institutions that are trying to suppress the Black, Brown, Asian, Native Americans in the country. So I guess it just takes a really collective effort to, not only learn about past history, but just to be accepted among one another. Because that's kind of why I wanted to raise the question. That, you know, you're spot on with everything, obviously, but uh, it's really on the individual themselves, not just legislation, because we have to start it in order to have the legislators enact upon it for sure, and
Mhm.
it starts locally.
Yeah. Um, I would say the only people who feel threatened by equality and the intentional pursuit and cultivation of equality are the people who are thoroughly and to some extent culturally invested in inequality. I
Yeah.
don't think that a person like Monica, I'm assuming you identify as white. I think you spoke last week and you said something about you identify as white, yes?
I mean, I identify as the hyphenate that you were talking about last week. I'm
Right.
Italian American.
Italian American. Okay, sure. Um,
I'm first generation born in the States. My parents both immigrated to the States.
right on. Thank you for that, and I'll remember that and keep that in mind for future sessions. I don't get the impression that you're threatened by anything we're talking about here. She shook her head no, or they
Not by
shook their
any
head no. She
means.
heard. Yes. She shook her head no. I don't get that impression. And that's because nothing that I'm saying here is about anti-whiteness. We're only talking about elevating historically marginalized populations to a point of relative equality. And then perhaps developing an American culture around the intentional preservation of equality. In my opinion, that is what the goal of America should aspire to. And I firmly believe in leveraging statistics, data, analytics, analytical power, excuse me, as a way to drive that cultivation. But it's only about equality. It's not about undermining or delegitimizing white identity. It's not about trying to persecute any particular group of people and leaving them behind as we elevate everybody else. It's about genuinely leaning into what is at the core of the American experiment, which is using intellectualism, knowledge, philosophy, and the promise and hope of a better tomorrow to cultivate that in the world of today. And so then that's where you could call me a liberal. You could say, oh, you're a liberal. I don't identify as liberal. I identify as independent.
Woke.
Yeah. Oh, you're woke. Well, yeah,
Woke.
because I've woken up to the reality of what America has been, but I also am keenly aware of what this country can be, right?
Yes.
And so what this country can be is something that I will firmly advocate for. I will firmly lean into, and I'm going to do whatever I can in my power to motivate those around me to do the same. And so then somehow collectively, it doesn't matter what color your skin is, what your last name is, where you come from, where your parents come from. We're all American. And the only people who are positioning themselves as anti-American are the people who are anti those beliefs and values. And right now, apparently on Jubilee, they're calling themselves fascist now. And
Oh
many of
wow.
them are entertaining fascism. So it just becomes a thing where you start seeing that like politically conservative people, they call themselves patriots, but they're not. They say their interest is in preserving the culture of the nation, and yet they can't define what that is. And then I'm telling you what the culture of the nation can be is the culture of equality. And then they go, but wait, not like that.
What
But
does an
what's
American even look like though? Like,
today, right? What does an American look like? It looks like a collective representation of the people of the world. So we are
yeah.
the country that has the ability to pioneer, like path pave a road to global humanitarianism. And the only thing stopping us from doing so is the politics of white supremacy.
Yes.
Full stop. So this is why I call, for those of you who are listening on the IG live, this is why I, in addition to other things, why I call Charlie Kirk a white supremacist, because that is literally what he is. A person who looks like Charlie Kirk, I also have as cousins. I have cousins that look like him, believe it or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Okay, we're all American here. We're all in the same boat. And my cousins and my sister Monica here, they're not threatened by anything because nothing I'm saying is anti-white. So what is it that you're really threatened by? The only thing you're threatened by are the very principles that you align yourself by calling yourself a patriot, but you're not actually a patriot. You're a fascist.
No, they just want the easy way out. And, one thing I did want to know is, the current path and trajectory that we're actually going on. What is the end goal and the end result that they're actually looking for? Because what that actually looks like, that they don't want to tell anybody, we're either speaking Chinese or Russian
Hmm.
in 30 years. Like,
I think there is a grasp of desperacy. I don't, believe it or not, I don't think that the average Midwestern American white person wants to live in a country where they speak Russian or speak Chinese or something like that. I think the desperation is because they would like to maintain a firm grasp on power, political power, and social and cultural control. They're desperately clinging to whatever they can grasp onto. Having said that, I firmly believe that the end point here is something that looks like The Handmaid's Tale, or is just
okay.
a basic return to a culture of slavery. And it doesn't matter if it's the blacks who are enslaved; it could be the first Americans who are enslaved. If you're following my language, if you've been following me for a while, the point is to get to a place in which there is a natural, politically sanctioned racial hierarchy with those who call themselves white at the top, and everyone who isn't white being steps or increments downward from there. And so, in my opinion, I do think that is led by a fundamental misunderstanding. Hear me out, because I am not a Second Amendment pundit. I do not endorse or condone violence. I am simply acknowledging the political reality that across the country, there are firearm owners everywhere. So good luck trying to enslave somebody who you gave the constitutional right to own firearms. You can't backtrack on that. And the only point that I'm making here, again, I do not condone violence. I do not endorse something like a civil war. I will always repeat that however many times I need to. I am simply encouraging the philosophical exploration of what it would actually look like to practically backtrack on. You've already opened up the Pandora's box for the Second Amendment. Now try re-enslaving people. Try creating the Handmaid's Tale. It's not practical. It doesn't work. So the only things they really have are trying to ally themselves with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And then in the end, it's really just stepping on your own toes and it's self-destruction. And the net outcome is going to be a continuation of the arc of justice, or the arc of a better tomorrow bending towards justice. And it'll be the same shit all over again, and we'll win. Monica?
Kind of speaking about what you're already kind of on, and you discussed earlier that it's almost like effectively history repeating itself, because you had made the connection between like the nativism and the things that like Charlie Kirk is saying right now. Mm-hmm. Kind of in thinking about if history is repeating itself, what's kind of coming next in terms of where they're going at this point? Because you just spoke about where they'd like to go, but is that the likelihood of potentially where we are going?
I mean, when you look at something like Project 2025, it appears like that's the desired goal. And yes, to some extent, okay, yes, you can abuse the extents of presidential power to try to make that happen, but there's still unpredictable elements with a population of 500 million. And some of those unpredictable elements are, you were able to get away with that in the early days of the 1700s because it was only guns and muskets, and then there were laws to prevent the people you're marginalizing from having access to those things. But now that's not the case anymore. So now try to raid somebody's home and then try to put them in shackles and put a chain around their neck in the modern era. You might be able to get away with that with like a few houses, but all across
Yeah.
America, it's not practical. So it becomes a thing where you're making your own checkmate happen. And yeah, you want to enact Project 2025, and ideally but all that's gonna do on the back end is it's gonna make it more difficult for you to have a stable political footing in the future. And there's no good outcome coming from pursuing these ends. Again, that's not me. I repeat, and I will always repeat, I do not encourage violence. I do not condone violence. I don't like the prospect of a civil war that Donald Trump is pushing for. I do not endorse, I don't encourage firearm ownership or anything like that. I am simply exploring the philosophical reality and the practical reality of trying to backtrack on rights and freedoms that Americans have had for quite some time now, and now you want to leverage fascism to try to revert us back to a time period that pretty much nobody wants to go to, even if they identify as conservative. Good luck with that. It's not going to happen. So we just have to watch the spoiled, rich, bratty children cry and bitch and moan for the next few years, and
Yeah.
the people they're paying to bitch and moan, we have to watch them whimper and cry and yell for a little bit before we finally turn the page. I'm just going to be that person for the rest of my life, I guess, encouraging America to finally and intentionally turn the page on the politics of racial inequality, turn the page on the idea of like denying other people equal access, and lean into this idea that protecting the rights and freedoms of another person who does not look like you is inherently protecting your own rights and freedoms. And that's where I
Thank you.
sit at the political table. That's where I'm at. I don't care if you're Muslim. I don't care if you're gay. I don't care if you're trans or lesbian. Your interests are my interests. You're a Christian. You're a Jew. It doesn't matter. Your interests are my interests. I am also a person who I think the United States should no longer have any political ties to Israel, and that's how I feel. And that's for
Thank you.
That's for a humanitarian reason. It's for a political reason. I don't know if I'd ever run for a political office. If I did, I'd fundamentally be anti-Israel. But in being anti-Israel, I am pro-United States. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
because
Yes.
I see our connection to this country as a threat to national security, and in the interest of our own national security, I have a desire to turn the page on inequality and steer us firmly in a direction towards identifying what equality looks like for all of us and the common good for all of us who are here and the people who want to be here. And that just looks like a humanitarian political effort. So that's where I'm at politically. I don't identify as conservative. I don't identify as liberal. I identify as independent. I know there's a lot of left-leaning people who don't agree with me on a lot of things that I say. I just feel how I feel.
Mhm.
And that's
That's
where I'm
some
at.
real stuff. That's real stuff for real. Because I mean, how are we going to move forward and succeed in the country if we're trying to suppress somebody else?
You
It
can't.
doesn't work. It
It doesn't
doesn't
work.
work. You
So
need everybody to do good. There's
yeah,
not enough, white people in the world, in the country, in order for us to move forward. There
no.
literally isn't.
I think maybe something like this, not necessarily this verbiage, but I think in moving forward, again, I'm not anti-religious, I'm not anti-Christian, but I think instead of one nation under God, maybe we should have something along the lines of your interests are my interests, or e pluribus
Understand that?
unum,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
That's the fundamental principle of what it means to be American, and I identify as American. And so then when we get to a place where culturally we have established equality as a precedent in this country, then I don't mind calling myself conservative because that's the culture that I'm conserving. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right, right. We're not there yet, so I'm not conservative. Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Vera, really quickly, did you want to say something?
Yes. Um, how would you go about a student that you have I have a student that's constantly the things that we read in our class, they're about race and white supremacy, and he always mumbles stuff under his breath. I already had to send him an email with the way he talks to me. This is very common for the other women of color in our department, in our English department. I had to email my chair over the weekend so we can discuss further, about the way he goes about things in class and just this superiority that he thinks he has over not only me, but the other students.
Yeah.
And it's just like, how to navigate something like that. We're only week 2 in the semester. We've only finished week 2. So I see him as always coming and having that attitude and challenging and trying to force his way or try to like strong arm me, which is not going to work. But like, how would you like navigate something like that? Because this is going to be a prolonged issue with him.
Yeah, sure. So I really briefly, because we're out of time. I have had in the past, I've had experience like this, not just with what I told you last week, but when I was a grad student, I had somebody who didn't even belong to my class sitting outside of the door, shouting corrections while I was teaching, and his corrections weren't even correct, right? But he felt like he was qualified enough to interrupt and to intervene and to do these things. I think in your case, because the student is registered in the class and the university does in fact have an obligation not to deny anyone access to the education they're paying for, you just want to have a discussion with them about disruptive behavior and classroom etiquette, and that it's okay for him to feel the way that he feels. Obviously, you can't control how anyone politically feels in your classroom or what they think or what they agree with and what they don't. It's okay to have differing opinions, but at some level, you also have to understand that the dominating the discussions is not conducive to help allowing us to thoroughly explore the concepts that you would like to explore in class in order for you to check off the points that you need to within a limited amount of time. You can encourage him, document it with an email, encourage him to, in the future, limit your contributions, the contributions you make in class, and consider that. And if adjustments cannot be adequately made, then perhaps we need to elevate it with a discussion with the chair. And usually the chair has enough power and authority and sway to be able to intervene in this regard. And things would only escalate from there, but you can document in an email, so you have an email proof with a cordial email basically saying that the student and their perspectives, I'm saying this my language because this is my approach. Your views and your perspectives are welcome, but please do not dominate so much that it then derails our ability to conduct class. And then from there, just with a nice little end, just a polite warning that if this continues, then we may have to elevate this to the chair, and then leave it there. And then if it continues, then follow suit. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for attending. And for those of you who are listening on the IG Live, I encourage you to click the link in my bio every week. You'll have access to the Zoom link where you can jump in. You can see the slides. Join me. And if there's enough people, I'd love to run one little exercise where we start exploring what it means to belong to our racial identity, and then to listen to what other people have to say in answering these kinds of questions. It's very illuminating. If we can get there, I'd love to get there. But as always, thank you for attending. I'll see you next week. I did mention last week we were talking about media, and then I shifted towards immigration because I thought that was a little bit more relevant. But next week we'll be talking about racism in mass media. I hope to see you there. All right, people. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.